Hi everyone, and welcome back to Comics and the Graphic Novel. Today we'll be talking about comics analysis and how to analyze them, like what strategies we use, how it differs from the kinds of strategies that we would use to analyze something more straightforwardly textual, like a novel. And so we'll talk about that, give you the tools you need, and then I will leave it to you in the discussion to kind of work through as a class, analyzing Sandman, a particular Sandman comic called Ramadan. And I'll give you a little bit of background about Sandman as well, just because that might influence things if we decide to look at the story through a lens of like author biography or something, or historical context. So, obviously, we can do standard literary analysis with comics. And those kind of big elements of fiction you may have learned about: plot, character, setting, point of view, style, theme, voice. Hopefully you're familiar with these from a previous English class. All of these things can be analyzed with just about any story. And a lot of them don't really change a ton when you're changing mediums. On the other hand, some of them do. Things like style and point of view are going to be done quite differently in comics versus more traditional text. And this will hold for other visual media, like movies and TV shows and such. Things that you can do very easily in written text, things like narration, are often a lot harder or trickier or more complex to do in something like comics or a TV show. So some of these will be handled differently, like style and voice, point of view. Others are going to be pretty much the same no matter how your story is told. Plot, character, setting, theme, that sort of stuff. In addition to those kinds of basic elements of fiction, however, there are also all of the tools of visual analysis, which obviously are used for analyzing things like pictures and movies and TV shows. Since this is a serial format involving images, much like a TV show and a movie, you can use a lot of those same techniques and tools to look at comics. So things like the way an object or a character is represented visually, things like the use of color or the use of angles or perspective. Those are things you would not be looking at in a novel, but you would maybe in a movie or TV show, and those you can use for comics as well. And then, of course, in this format that is kind of a weird hybrid of the textual formats and the visual formats, there are also things that are pretty much exclusive to the comics form that you can also use to analyze a comics text. And this is going to include those things that we learned about in our terminology video. Panels, gutters, speech balloons, word balloons, thought balloons, whichever terms you want to use for them. Captions. All of these and other comic-specific things you can also use to help you analyze a text. So, I've uploaded a comics analysis sheet to Blackboard, which I think works kind of well as a kind of cheat sheet, I guess, except without the cheating part. That is basically just questions and prompts to help you do some kind of in-depth close-up comics analysis. So first of all, summary. This is the surface of your story. What is the reader being shown, explicitly shown? Where is what you're looking at coming in the text, and what part is it playing in the larger text? Basically, what is going on the surface? Like the plot, basically, or characterization, or things like that, but not subtle characterization. This is like, what is this character doing? So once you figure out what's going on, then look at the structure. So how is the page or pages set up? When we have panels, how many? What size? And are they differing in size, or are they all the same? What order do we read it in? Do the panels have borders or not? Are they popping out of the panels into the gutters, that sort of thing. Are there any of those kind of things happening? And if so, what could it mean that those things are happening? Again, nothing happens by accident in a comic. Like in a novel, like you straight up have to create everything from scratch. So, like whoever is the artist or writer chose to set up this many panels in this order, depicting this in each one, and having the panels appear in this way. Why did they do that? Why might they have made the choices that they did? You notice that anything that seems unusual in this structure, whether that's panels, whether that's panel borders, whether that's gutters, why do you think the creators made this choice? Why might they have chosen to do it this way? So once we look at structure, then there's visuals. This is where we're going to get a lot of those same things from movies and TV shows. So what is represented visually in the art of the comic? What is not represented? Sometimes what is not shown can be as significant as what is shown. Think like a lot of your 80s 80s horror flicks, and which violence they decided to show versus which violence they chose to only imply and how they chose to apply it. So again, especially with things like violence, like sex, sometimes it is a choice what not to show. And sometimes in doing so, that actually makes it more impactful. I think we all are probably familiar with horror movies where, in a lot of ways, with a lot of horror movies, what makes them scary is that the bad guy is like barely seen. You get a glimpse in shadow. Some of those movies, once like the bad guy / monster comes out and is like fully visible, they're less scary because like when you just see a shadow, it could be anything. When a guy in a hockey mask comes out, it's a guy in a hockey mask, and yeah, like if he's wielding a chainsaw, it's pretty scary. But nevertheless, like that rules out a lot of shit that you could have been scared of before. So, what is being shown, and what is being chosen to be shown? What is not being shown, and what is being chosen to not be shown? How are characters and settings represented visually? So, like, what kind of way are they clothed? What kinds of colors are being used for them? All of that kinds of in what way is a character being represented visually, or the place that they're in? And we kind of know how much difference this can make just from things like superhero costumes. If you see, Wolverine in like his yellow spandex versus Wolverine in his black leather from the X movies, it's a very different look, and it comes across very differently in our perception of the character. So what effect does choosing to represent your characters or you're saying this way have on the reader? Color. What are the main colors used in the art if color is used? Obviously with some kinds of comics like Japanese manga, they tend to mostly be black and white. But if they're using color, what color are they using? Is it primarily cool colors versus warm colors? Is it grays and browns versus bright colors? Those are going to give very different impressions, and those are going to lead readers to have a very different kind of perception of what's going on and the events and the characters. Something that can be used in both black and white and color stuff. Is it more dominated by darkness and shadow or by light? Is there a lot of heavy black with things being cast in shadow, or is the places we're seeing black primarily in things like the line art that sets our characters apart from the backgrounds in each other? Are there any unusual perspectives or angles from which the panels are represented? So again, this can really make a difference in how we see things. If we're looking up at things from below, they tend to look larger, more imposing, scarier. If we're looking down on things from above, they tend to seem more insignificant. They tend to seem more harmless. They tend to seem, like more childlike. And looking at the same thing from above versus below can make it come off very differently. Are they doing anything really artistic with the angles in terms of, are we like, do we get any shots like the gun barrel shot from the famous like 007 intro, things like that. You can notice anything that seems unusual in the visuals, anything at all, either something like this or anything else. What effect do you think it ends up having on the reader? And why might the creators have chosen to do it this way and not some other way? Then we have the text. So we looked at the images, now we look at the text. How is the dialogue represented? Are there any unusual representations of dialogue? Something other than your standard speech balloon, speech bubble, whatever term you want to use. So when you have speech balloons that have odd shapes or odd coloring or odd fonts being used for the words, this is giving this is signaling in some way that this speech is not standard, normal, human, regular speech. Sometimes it'll just be something as small as like, writing a text smaller, the text in a speech balloon smaller to signify that, it's being kind of whispered or it's quiet. Sometimes it'll involve, like some cosmic entity having their speech bubbles look like kind of really weird and bananas to signify that, they're speaking in some weird, like James Earl Jones as Darth Vader on steroids kind of way. So pay attention to how that text tends to be presented. Both in speech balloons and in other kinds of representations. So thought balloons, narration, sound effects, all of that is text, all of that counts. Sound effects especially, some folks can do some really interesting things with, because it's text, but it's also representing something that is very much not text. It's representing sound. Again, if you notice anything that seems unusual in the way the text appears, what effect do you think this has on the reader, and why might the creators have made this choice? And finally, we have questions about the medium. So, obviously, this is a comic, whatever we're reading and evaluating as a comic. It's not a novel or a TV show or a music video or something like that. So what can this do as a comic that it perhaps couldn't do in some other form? Novel or movie, like interpretive dance, whatever. There's a lot of different ways you can tell a story. Why choose this one for this story? Why tell this story in comics form and not in some other medium? Sometimes it's as straightforward as, well, this is the graphic novel adaptation of a novel, and so clearly they want to make this accessible to comics fans. Even so, they're probably doing things very, very differently as a result, just because you kind of have to, because you're not writing a novel, you're creating a comic. So, what is it that this can do as a comic that it can't do in any other form? And why tell this story as a comic story and not as something else? And this should come as no surprise to us. Like something like the Harry Potter books and the Harry Potter movies are very, very different. Something like, the Marvel comics versus the Marvel Cinematic Universe movies that are based on them are very different. So adaptations, they're going to have to be tailored to the comics form. And some stories just work best told as comics. And so that's why the authors choose to tell them as comics. If you're going to tell a story deconstructing superheroes like Watchmen or Invincible, that Invincible deconstructs, but it also kind of reconstructs. You're going to tell that story originally in the most common format for superheroes, which is comics. So it makes sense. So these are things to kind of keep in mind when you're looking at a comic, when you're analyzing a comic. And keep in mind you'll also want to be asking these questions on this sheet, in addition to the more standard questions that we use when dealing with writing literature, so things about plot, character, theme, etc. So in addition to, these questions, you also want to be asking those standard ones like, why is this character acting in this way? Or like, what is the conflict of this plot? That sort of stuff. So hopefully you're feeling a little more prepared to do some analysis of comics. And we are going to be doing our first analysis in the discussion. And obviously, and like I said, anyone to do a full analysis. It's hopefully, as each person adds their thoughts, it'll add up to a full like in-depth analysis. But before we get to that, I would like to just briefly talk about Ramadan, the comic we're going to read, and the larger comic it's part of, Sandman. So, this particular story is by Neil Gaiman and P. Craig Russell. And Neil Gaiman is very well known as an author. You are almost certainly familiar with at least some of the things he's written. He wrote, perhaps most kind of prominent lately, he created the series that the Stars, or he created the book that the Star series American Gods is based on. And he co-wrote the novel that the Amazon TV series Good Omens is based on. And also, I believe he show-ran the series, the Amazon series as well. Other books he's been made into like popular media. The kids animated film Coraline was based on one of his books. The movie Stardust, based on one of his novels. He worked on the animated Beowulf, the computer animated Beowulf that came out like 15 or so years ago film. So he's worked quite a lot in Hollywood, and he's worked quite a lot in comics as well. Most notably, upcoming projects that are being worked on based on his work are Netflix is doing a Sandman series. So if you like this particular story, maybe you'll be able to see it in some form on Netflix in some undefined amount of time. So that's Neil Gaiman. He is the creator of Sandman and is the person who wrote the entire series. he wrote it all the way through. The artist for this, P. Craig Russell, is, or was, I think he's still alive, yeah. He's a well-known artist, multiple awards in comics. He is, in fact, I believe, the first mainstream comic book creator to come out as openly gay. And he's pretty well known for working on some Marvel Swords and Sorcery comics that I mentioned, in my history of the comics. Stuff like Conan and Ulrika Melnibone. He also did a lot of work with Gaiman, both this particular story for Sandman, but he also did art for some later standalone Sandman stories. He did, I think, the adaptation of Coraline into a comic. And he did I believe they did a comic based on a novel that he wrote, or a novella he wrote, Sandman, that's Sandman based. So he's done a lot of work with Gaiman, and I believe they're good friends. And again, both very well known, although not as well known, and at the time this was written in the mid '90s as they are, now as like veterans of the industry, and both definitely very strong writers and artists. So there is a reason that this comic comes in for a lot of praise, this particular issue of Sandman. So, Sandman is a long-running comic series, 75 issues, I believe. So that they're going to come out monthly, so it would have been probably 6 to 7 years that it ran for. Gaiman wrote all of it. Russell only illustrated this issue and a couple of other minor things. And then there's obviously many more Sandman spin-offs since. It was put out by DC Comics as part of their Vertigo imprint, which they use for their sort of more mature comics. Like Sandman was the like I said, how I talked about in the 90s was darker and edgier. That wasn't always bad, because Sandman was a good example, and a lot of the Vertigo comics were the same way. Like, yes, they did have stuff that was not kid-friendly, and it was darker and edgier, but it also gave rise to some really good and interesting stuff. So, Sandman centers around the titular Sandman, also known as Morpheus, who is, his title is Dream of the Endless. The Endless being like 7 kind of incarnations of like, I'm trying to think of the word, ideas. So there's like dream, there's death, there's destiny, despair, delirium, destruction. I feel like I'm missing one. Did I mention death already? Maybe. But regardless, he is one of these like immortal beings who specifically his realm is the realm of dreams. And so he is frequently approached by people in dreams or having to do with the realm of dreams, and in this particular case, he is playing that kind of role in Ramadan. So just kind of a little bit of background, so you know kind of where everything's coming from. It's like, so you know who at least Morpheus is, because the story does kind of assume you know who he is because it came fairly late in the comics run. Sandman, definitely check it out if you enjoy this. If you're on campus, once we get all of our books back in the Humanities Library after this move, we do have, I currently have on loan to the Humanities Library my copies of the Absolute Sandman, which has the entire series. So feel free to stop by the Humanities Library if you're on campus, once we're all back on campus again, and read it. If the Humanities Library is not open, I'm not quite sure how we're going to handle that as far as hours and such. If I'm there, stop by my office and I'll be happy to let you in to read it. So that is just something to keep in mind if you enjoy this. Otherwise, obviously you can also buy it yourself on Amazon or get it from the library. There's a lot of different ways to consume Sandman. So what I would like to do is to talk about Sandman as a discussion using those same strategies that we've talked about today. Specifically, I'd like you to kind of look at Ramadan, this particular issue, with those things in mind. It is doing some really interesting things artistically, like things that are fairly unusual for comics even, or at least were at the time. And so it's worth looking at what it's doing that seems like it might be normal for comics and what might not. Obviously, this is a little easier if you are familiar with comics, but certainly, even if you're brand new to comics, I still would like to hear what you have to say, because sometimes people who come from different perspectives will have very different things to say about something. And people who are new to comics, sometimes it can be really interesting to see like which things they have no problems grasping and which things they maybe struggle a bit with, or which things that come off very differently to someone who is an experienced, seasoned comics veteran versus someone who is just now starting to look at comics. So the kind of prompts that I have set up are what jumped at you at your initial reading of the comic. So this is for that kind of close reading process. What are those things that you noticed in the close reading process? What is it that seemed unusual or interesting or important or worth looking at? What is the kind of story that Gaiman and Russell are telling here? And how does the type of story change the storytelling tools they use? What is it that they use for this kind of like Arabian Nights influenced story that they might not for something else that's not influenced by that? Are there any interesting visual elements in the comic? Anything that seems to have an impact on you as a reader when you're reading it? And if so, like, what is it and why? Is there anything interesting going on with the way that the text is being represented and why? And then finally, what can this story do as a comic that it couldn't do in another medium? And as the discussion topic will say. This might be even more relevant given that Netflix is currently working on that Sandman TV series. If it runs long enough, it will probably adopt this story. So in some future iteration of this class, we will probably be like comparing this to the actual, filmed version of this story and seeing how they differ. Unfortunately, until then, we only have the one version to work with. So hopefully you find it interesting and enjoyable to read. Hopefully you find good things to say about it in terms of like interesting ways to contribute to the discussion. And hopefully it leads to some good discussion on all of our parts. So that'll be it for today's video. And again, that the comics analysis sheet is available on Blackboard, along with Ramadan itself. And then you'll have, and the discussion forum should be up by the time this video goes up. So post to our discussion on week 3 Ramadan. And I look forward to seeing what you all come up with. And then I will see you, I believe, next week. So I'll talk to you later.